The neon pink lien notice was slapped against my hand-carved mahogany door like a death warrant. Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed queen of the Shady Oaks Homeowners Association, stood on my sidewalk with her arms crossed, her face scrunched up as if she just swallowed a lemon. You really thought you could ignore the architectural guidelines for 3 months without a price to pay, didn't you? Her voice had that grating, high-pitched American suburban trill that made my teeth ache. I took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine from my garden filling my lungs. But it couldn't mask the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated rage. Why on earth would you think a legal document belongs on a historical landmark? Beth? My voice trembling not with fear, but with the sheer effort of not losing my mind right there on the porch. She just laughed. A dry, hacking sound that echoed off the white columns of my home. Historical landmark? Honey, this is just a pile of rotting wood that doesn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. I stepped down the stairs, the old wood groaning under my feet, a familiar, comforting sound that felt like the house was whispering to me to stay calm. The sun was beating down on the Georgia soil, and I could hear the distant drone of a lawnmower, the quintessential soundtrack of a neighborhood obsessed with uniformity. Mrs. Gable waved a manicured hand toward my wraparound porch. The HOA board has voted, and since you refuse to paint this eyesore a neutral beige and tear down that raggedy old stone wall, we've placed a lien on the property. Pay the $10,000 in accumulated fines by Friday, or we start the foreclosure process. Do you understand? Or do I need to speak slower? My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. $10,000? For preserving the original stone boundary hand-laid by my great-great-grandfather? I felt a heavy sigh escape my lips, a sound of exhaustion that had been building for years. You're trying to steal a house that has been in my family since before this association? Was a twinkle in a developer's eye. She didn't even blink. She just adjusted her oversized sunglasses and checked her watch. Times change, Elias. Either fall in line or get out. The air felt thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's grill, but all I could focus on was the smug grin on her face. I walked back inside without another word, the screen door slamming with a sharp, percussive crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. I sat down at my roll-top desk, my fingers tracing the deep grooves in the wood. How did it come to this? How did a woman who moved here 3 years ago get the power to threaten a legacy that survived the Reconstruction era? I pulled out a dusty, leather-bound portfolio, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside were yellowed papers, smelling of vanilla and old secrets, and a map drawn in fading ink. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls and late nights under the soft, amber glow of my desk lamp. I could hear the crickets chirping outside, taunting pulse. Every time I looked out the window, I saw Mrs. Gable's silver SUV prowling the street like a shark in shallow water. She wanted a fight? But she had no idea she was stepping onto a battlefield that had been fortified for over a century. I spent hours at the county records office, the air-conditioned chill biting at my skin while I pored over microfilms and deed registries. The clerk, an elderly man with thick glasses, watched me with curiosity. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. I didn't look up. "I'm looking for the heartbeat of this town," I muttered. And then I found it. The hidden clause, buried under layers of legal jargon from 1865, signed with a wax seal that had somehow remained intact through the decades. My hands shook as I realized what I was holding. "Mrs. Gable, you really should have checked the foundations before you tried to burn the house down. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating heat. The HOA board had gathered on my front lawn. A small crowd of neighbors hovering by the sidewalk like vultures waiting for a meal. Mrs. Gable was front and center, holding a clipboard like a scepter, ready to hand over the keys. Elias, or do we have to do this the hard way? She called out, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. I stepped out onto the porch, dressed in my best suit, holding a single manila folder. I noticed the way the wind rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree in my yard, the same tree that she had ordered me to chop down because it dropped too many leaves. Is everyone here? Beth. My voice calm, projecting across the lawn with a steady resonance I didn't know I possessed. I want to make sure everyone hears this. Mrs. Gable rolled her eyes, sighing loudly. We don't have time for a speech. Do you have the money or not? I smiled. And for the first time in months, it felt genuine. I have something better, I said. I pulled out a copy of the 1865 land grant. You see, this neighborhood, Shady Oaks, was built on land that was partitioned from my family's original estate in the 1970s. But there was a very specific condition in the original deed of sale to the developers. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Gable's face paled just a fraction, her grip tightening on the clipboard. What are you talking about? That's ancient history. I stepped off the porch and walked toward her, the gravel crunching under my shoes, a sharp, satisfying sound. Actually, it's a living contract. You see, in 1865, my ancestor ensured that this specific plot of land and the access roads leading to it were designated as an independent sovereign tract. When the developers bought the surrounding fields to build these cookie-cutter houses, they signed a covenant agreeing that this property would never be subject to any local ordinances, municipal levies, or, and this is the best part, any private homeowner associations. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air, broken only by the distant whistle of a bird. According to this deed, which was ratified by the state legislature, the Shady Oaks HOA has no legal jurisdiction over this property. None. Mrs. Gable let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. You're insane. A piece of paper from the Civil War era doesn't trump our bylaws. I held up a second document, this one bearing a fresh, official seal from the state attorney general's office. I spent my week well, Mrs. Gable. I had the deed verified. And while I was at it, I had a surveyor out here. It turns out that when the HOA built that fancy clubhouse and the gated entrance last year, you encroached nearly 15 feet onto my deeded property line. I leaned in closer, close enough to see the sweat beads forming on her upper lip. Not only is your lien fraudulent and illegal, but you are currently trespassing on private, sovereign land. And since the HOA is in violation of the original land use agreement, I have the right to demand the immediate removal of all HOA structures on my property. That includes the gate that keeps this exclusive community private. The silence that followed was deafening. The neighbors began to whisper, their eyes darting from me to the trembling Mrs. Gable. What? The gate? That would drop our property values by 30%. Someone shouted from the back. Mrs. Gable's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. You can't do this, she stuttered, her voice cracking. I looked her dead in the eye, feeling the weight of my ancestors standing right there behind me on that porch. And I will. Of course, the board signs a total waiver of all claims against this property, pays for the legal fees I've incurred this week, and issues a formal, public apology for the harassment. And one more thing. I tapped the pink lien notice still stuck to my door. You're going to peel that off with your own hands. Right now. The sound of her heels clicking on my stone walkway was the sweetest music I had ever heard. With the entire neighborhood watching, the queen of the HOA had to humble herself, reaching up to scrape the adhesive off the mahogany she had so recently insulted. Her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps of humiliation. As she turned to leave, her authority shattered like cheap glass. I felt a surge of something powerful, not just spite, but justice. This house had stood through fire and poverty. It wasn't about to be taken down by a woman with a clipboard and a vendetta. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy in the air had shifted. People weren't looking at my house as an eyesore anymore. They were looking at it as a fortress. I stood on my porch as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. The jasmine smelled sweeter than ever. I realized then that heritage isn't just about old walls and dusty papers. It's about the grit to stand your ground when the world tries to pave over your soul. Justice might move slow, like the growth of an ancient oak, but its roots are deep, and they are unbreakable. I looked at the gate at the end of the street, the gate that I now technically owned a piece of, and I knew that from now on, things were going to be very, very different in Shady Oaks. Power belongs to those who remember where they came from, and I wasn't going anywhere.